So as this painting progresses, this will be a more natural, realistic portrayal of how I personally work. My palette in general is more subdued. I don't use a lot of flashy or very hot colors often, so I largely begin by not being too precious about keeping my paints separate or distinct at first. For the starting sketch, I stick to loose but angular lines, kind of like each part is a small box that end up building on each other. And I start to lay in the areas where I see definite shadow. Notice that I'm not taking any of my marks to any kind of full render. Acrylic dries relatively quickly, so I don't want to be left with solid areas that are hard to pass over with going too far too fast. So now that I've laid down my first general sketch, I'm going to go in and tighten up areas, increase the proportions, anything that makes a more accurate blueprint for myself. So I'm going to continue. I'm going to add some more black to my colder brown that I've been working with, just so that the points of which I'm going to be adjusting will be more apparent to me. If I kept it with the same color, I might get visually confused. I've found that the tighter I make my underpainting or underdrawing, oddly enough, the more freedom I have when I go into laying my paint because the structure will stay solid and firm. I also can mark out the certain areas that are going to get more light than the others. And I'm not afraid to lay in the areas where more shadow will be in place as well. For me, this is the point where I take the most time in developing how my painting is going to look overall. And even though there's a gradation of light on the left eye socket, I'm not going to worry about that right now. I'm just going to try to aim to get an accurate outline of how the socket is shaped. And it was much bigger than my initial laydown of color. And I'm also including the shadow here that's edging towards the bridge of the nose, done by the light. And in order for me to read it a little bit better for myself, I'm just going to add the smallest amount of white just to help me visually separate as I go along. As I work on a piece, I'm continually taking mental notes. This takes a lot of practice to do. But one thing you could do is if an idea comes to you about how to develop a shape, or you laid down paint in a certain way, have a notepad with you or a bunch of post-it notes where you can jot down immediately after you achieve that accidental success or had that idea, so that you can keep it with you, and then you start to build your library of knowledge through that experiential method, and in time you're just going to remember what you did. I've now started to work in the deeper shadow tones, and a greater sense of refinement overall is taking place. I'm also starting to push the shadows deeper with a heavier addition of the black into my mixes. But I'm not covering all of it, just select parts to give the deepest shadows some tonal variation. This is how you can create that shift of light. And then if I add even more light, this is how we start to develop the illusion of a form turning in space without having to do the value block of the squares. This is it in action. You'll see that I work very sequentially, and I'm not blending anything together. I'm simply just layering the shifting values next to one another. Little areas that might have more of a mid-tone range, and just dropping in those spots. I'm really loading my brush. My brush is extremely saturated with paint because I want to make a bit of a sloppy look to this skull. Not sloppy as in careless, but sloppy as in I'm not going to be too worried about taking this to a more polished or refined looking piece of work. I'm now going to go the completely opposite way. And I'm going to mix some of my reds and see what kind of light I can give the impression of. I'm now going to go the completely opposite way, and I'm going to mix some of my reds and see what kind of light I can give the impression of. I'm going to put just a little bit of the green mid-tone shadow paint in here to see if we can still get that kind of rolling effect. Especially where the light is back and forth a lot. You can still have two different colors, but they can be within the same value. And that can really be a key to the success of your painting reading really well. So I'm going to continue to lay in general mid-tone, and I don't mind now if I start mixing my lighter colors with the darker ones, so it's a mushy little mix. If I need to deepen it, I'm going to add black for these teeth. And then I'll right mix back some white. Now there's an area right here that has a lot of awesome reflected light. With this reflected light, I really want it to stand out. So I'm going to be increasing the chroma or the intensity of the paint that I'm putting down, because even though I'm going for the skull as a whole, I really want the focal point to be the points of light that are really sticking out from within the shadow. And if I need to lower it just a little bit, but still have a type of intensity, I add the black. Right here, I'm just going to use straight red for the hottest parts. Now, if I do this too much all over the skull, it may take on a more even appearance because the light will be looking much more distributed. And so I'm going to hold off after just this one part because I might just want it as that kind of visual spark to go for a very dramatic look. I'm going to work the rest of this with a little larger brush, and then we're going to start the process of refinement. It is getting sort of blurry to me right here. This has more red in it, so I'm going to mix a cool gray with the green as a predominant undertone. It's way too green, so I'm just going to take my brush down here, add more white. Since this is also where the light is coming from, I'm liking where the direction of this color is going, so I'm just going to leave it like this. You can use these huge swaths of background paint as kind of an eraser in a way as well. I really like to leave my brush strokes apparent. That's something that came to me later on in my artistic journey. I used to be very obsessed with making things look as realistic and flawless in my brain as possible, and that meant no brush strokes. But actually, the more I studied really good painters, the more I realized that they utilize all the tools they have to create the impression, and often that means retaining brush strokes. So I gave it a shot, and I'm like, oh wow, what a difference that makes. Because that's the other thing, we can really get hung up on the wrong things too quickly. Not the wrong things, but the smaller things that can make a real huge difference, but way too early in the game. That can cause a lot of dysfunction to arise in your painting because you're still not looking at it as a whole. You're kind of micromanaging your painting, which, I mean, I love doing. Everybody loves doing that because the details are what's so fun. But I'm still in the stage where I have to look at the big picture. I am very much informed by what happens on the palette. I never had almost the ability to plan something out and stick with it. And that has both its pros and cons. So I never want to be like, you have to work like this is what works for me, so it should work for you. It's like, no. However you want to organize your palette is up to you. And what may seem like chaos to one person is absolute harmony to another. We're now in the third and final aspect of this project, where I'm going to be doing the mid-tone developments and specifically finishing off the chin, and generally rounding everything out to a finished piece. There's going to be a number of longer unedited time lapses in this section, where you can see my palette process for mixing and picking colors as I near the end stages of the project. Ultimately, I ended up not including any kinds of bold impasto, but I do use some blending, notably within the eye socket a little bit later on, to give that variety of brushwork that I'd been talking about previously. But I continually go back and forth adjusting these brushstroke styles to give the eye lots of engagement and small points of focus while trying to retain an overall harmony. So I'm now entering the stage of really pumping up the highlights and bringing my highlight mixes closer in value with my shadow mixes. These are going to produce colors that will read as gradation across the varying forms that are found in the skull. And even though I'm not taking everything to like a realistic blend, it is going to lend a sense of realism regardless, because it's about values and your colors really over anything else or any other kind of technique that you could implement. Next, I'm going to pay attention to the eye socket on our right. These are some notes regarding how I treat it on the final pass. So there's really one more section left, and that's the chin and the lower teeth area. I'm just going to mix a whole bunch of new colors that sort of sit within this mid-tone range and just boost some things up and push other things back. If I had to do this over again, I think I would leave out these little hot bits that I added right at the end, or at least tone them down a little bit to match the shadow area. I really wanted it to come through, but it just ends up looking more like a sticker rather than a highlight that reads really well. I'm now towards the final brushstrokes in terms of this painting, and there's just a little bit of a correction that I wanted to make and mix a very interesting, not quite blended color here for a captivating kind of highlight that really isn't in the rest of the painting, just to give that extra little pop of interest. I'm just looking at the painting overall and seeing what little tiny suggestions I can add to sort of bring everything together in a very subtle way.